and today we are talking about major sins in the Quran. This is part A. All heavenly messages in general, and so Muhammad's message in particular, distinguish between two categories of divine commandments: orders, Gebote, or commandments, and prohibitions, Verbote. Orders are meant to guide human behavior. Orders are meant to guide humans' behavior to concrete actions by issuing a positive command, do it, while prohibitions restrict human behavior by asking people to avoid certain actions with a negative order, do not. Prohibited acts are classified as major or minor sins, the prohibition of idolatry being on top of the list of major sins. Commands also come in the categories major and minor. To have faith in the existence of God is a major command, kaba'ir, and the order to be polite to a passerby on the street is, so to speak, a minor command, sagha. Between these major and minor orders lies the command to believe in the last day, combined with the command to do righteous acts that are beneficial to society. It is one of God's blessings to the believers who received his orders that he made them love believe and hate unbelief, wickedness, and rebellion. Chapter 49, verse 7. Unbelief is an openly hostile view of a specific command or person, hence unbelief, kufr. In this context is a publicly declared enmity against Muhammad's message, and according to chapter 4, verse 37, a miserly that expresses a disbelief in God's bounty and grace. Transgression of God's order is called fisq, plural fusuq. When Iblis disobeyed God and did not bow down in front of Adam, he broke the command, فَفَسَقَ, of his Lord. Chapter of Kahf, verse 50. Transgression of God's prohibition is given the term isyan, which the text uses when it talks about Adam's rebellion against God's prohibition not to come near the tree. Thus did Adam disobey Asiya, this his Lord, and allow himself to be seduced. Taha 121. Another of God's great blessing is to tell those who have disobeyed his prohibition that if they avoid the major sins, kabad, Allah will expel out of you all the evil in you and admit you to a gate of great honor. Nisa 31. However, such forgiveness is the sole prerogative of God. No human ijtihad is allowed here. Prohibition in the book are thus divided into two categories: A, major sin, kaba'ir, that are fixed and absolutely valid for all times. These are the haram taboos. And B, minor sins, saghair, but while it is possible to enumerate the prohibitions in the book and qualify which of them is an absolute taboo, it is impossible to do so for the major sins, kaba'ir. The simple reason for this is that not all major sins were transgressions of absolute taboos, and it depends on the prevailing social condition whether a major sin was perceived as such. For example, the sins of idolatry, usury, and wine consumption were the gravest major sins during the first 13 years of Muhammad's mission and his confrontation with the standards of Meccan society and the prevailing norm of the tribe of Quraysh. After the migration to Medina, this changed to desertion from military duties after the ban to kill was lifted, which had not been previously mentioned as a major sin. In other contexts, during the time of Lot, the Prophet Lot, homosexuality was so wide practice that it had become the most serious major sin. Thus Allah had finally to send a new prophet messenger with the mission to restore heterosexual morality, redirecting Lot people back to the right path, and when they did not listen, they were destroyed. It is true that the book reiterates and reevaluates a number of previous prohibitions, and yet nowhere does it categorize them as major sins, kaba'ir. If the term kaba'ir is mentioned, it is without a definite article. That is, its numbers are kept indefinite because the noun with a definite article will suggest a limit of some kind that the book did not want to specify. Instead, the book says, yes, absolute taboos, muharramat, are major sins, kaba'ir, but not every major sin is an absolute taboo. The indefinite nature of kaba'ir allows us to consider the major sins, those things that are social regards as the gravest, most heinous crimes, which may change from epoch to epoch and from society to society. But we are not permitted to add such prohibitions to the list of absolute taboos, since these are defined only by God. B. The Prophet and major sins. The evidence that the prophetical understanding of major sins, as in most other areas, does not differ significantly from Quranic concept is overwhelming. In a hadith quoted by Razi, we hear, for example, that Muhammad considered public defamation of innocent women and false accusation of adultery as one of the most heinous crimes, without the context of his effort to establish a new society upon the sound basis of good relations within and between families and clans. We see Muhammad's definition of kaba'ir as a logical and necessary consequences of life in 7th century Arabia. It also corresponds to the book's appeal to root out injustice, dhulm, as one of the most serious dangers for the sound functioning of society. Since there was no political injustice and no oppressive usurpation of power in Medina at Muhammad's time, it was perfectly legitimate to target public defamations as a form of injustice that needed to be wiped out. One should also note that the Prophet did not use the definite article al when he talked about kaba'ir, but left it as undefined kaba'ir. Indeterminate and unspecified as he found it in the Quran. This indicates that when he proposed his understanding of what major sins are, he knew that it was only relevant for his own period of time and for his own society, and did not rule out the possibility that the perception of such sins might be subject to considerable change. Point C. The companions and major sins. After Muhammad's death, the effort to accurately define what constitutes a major sin and an absolute taboo were seriously undermined by the sudden circulation of obscure hadith traditions that, for example, used a bizarre number of kaba'ir ranging from 9 to 700, which were all treated as absolute taboos. We observed the tendency to blend together major and minor sins and proscriptions and absolute taboos, so that the clear demarcation lines eventually disappeared, and all the different types and classes of orders and prohibition were perceived equally and indiscriminately as what God has prohibited. Even then, it was obvious how weak the chains of transmission back to the Prophet were. D. The generations after the time of the companions, this situation became aggravated within 2 generations after the Prophet's death. We see an explosion of hadiths circulated in the different centers of the empire, and which could not possibly all go back to the Prophet. Bear in mind the fact that Muhammad received his first revelation at the age of 40, and that he died 23 years later at the age of 63. He had therefore 23 years as a prophet, that is, based on a lunar calendar, 195,408 hours, to discuss and debate the matters of the new faith, supposing for the sake of argument that he did not sleep a single minute throughout a 24-hour day. In addition to his role as a prophet and messenger who transmitted God's revelation to the people. If we assume that Muhammad had roughly 85,000 hours left to fulfill his prophetical role in his 10 years in Medina. And since we have now in front of us a total of 750,000 hadiths that were circulated after his death from his Medinian period, of which Imam Ahmad reported 40,000 in his Musnad alone, which means that the Prophet must have issued an average 9 hadiths per hour, which is, of course, absurd. Because of this very shaky basis for the authenticity of most hadith and the likelihood that a considerable number of were fabricated during the Umayyad and Abbasid period, we believe it is A, dishonest to assert the authenticity of the hadiths, and B, illegitimate to construct a body of text called Sunnah on the basis of such dubious evidence, fabricated hadiths, and then oblige Muslim believers to use it as binding source of law. We know that legal rulings can only be found in Muhammad's message, not his Sunnah. And that if the Sunnah was to be binding, it would mean a good deal of hardship socially and psychologically and financially. For most people today, which contradicts the book's imperative that God intends every facility for you, he does not want to put you to difficulties. Baqarah verse 185. And yet, we also know that after Muhammad's death, the community of believers increased more and more, with the empire becoming diverse and heterogeneous in its composition. Diversity led to tensions, and people began to disagree about the correct way of eating, drinking, dressing, and sleeping by quoting the examples of the Prophet to substantiate their own position and refute others. Every little dispute was transformed into a battle over the right methodology, creating separate schools for every single issue or particular opinion. This situation not only resulted in several schisms within the community, best illustrated by the Battle of the Camel and the battle at Siffin in 36 after Hijrah. It also led to further confusion over the term kaba'ir, which now came to be defined according to the position of the school, sectarian conflicts, and dynastic rivalries that more and more obscured the original concept of the book. Let us therefore return once more for the original source, the book. We said earlier that prohibitions express the negative aspects of divine legislation, and that the major sins are formulated as prohibitions, some of them in the form of absolute taboos. The difference between the generic form of prohibition and absolute taboos, which is one specific type of prohibition, is that the former contains rules that are contingent and that give people the choice between obedience and disobedience, while the latter are absolute and eternal, even though the former includes the latter. It also means that major sins, in contrast to absolute taboos, may increase or decrease in number according to the historical, legal, and moral context. If, for example, in a certain society, traffic incidents have reached an alarmingly high number because of the inconsiderate behavior of drivers, the authorities equipped with more legislative powers will change the attitude, and while having viewed inconsiderate driving as a minor offense in the past, will now regard it as a major crime and punish it with tougher sentences. This will continue until new regulations have made an impact and have reduced the number of incidents. In contrast, absolute taboos do not increase or decrease in number and do not change their content. To kill a person or to marry one's mother or sister remains haram everywhere. In London, Damascus, or Mecca, at all times in history, whether in the 7th, 20th, or 40th centuries. The book gives 14 absolute taboos, of which the first 9 are as follows. 1. Commit idolatry. 2. To be disrespectful to parents. 3. To kill one's children for fear of poverty. 4. To come close to shameful deeds, adultery. 5. To take life unjustified. 6. To consume the property of orphans. 7. To give false measures and weights. 8. To commit perjury. 9. To break a vow. This is different from an oath, which God has allowed us to expiate. But the vow of a doctor is a pledge to Allah, binding the doctor to the cure of his patients. Breaking a vow cannot be expiated by a fast or 3 days, or the feeding of 10 poor people. Unfortunately, many people often confuse an irrevocable vow to Allah with the expiatory oath, together with the 10th religious command, which is to follow the straight path. Chapter 6, verse 153. These 9 taboos compromise God's ethical guidance, Al-Furqan, elsewhere called the 10 Commandments, or the First/Old Testament. In addition, the following prohibitions received by Moses were eventually turned into absolute taboos through Muhammad's message. Part 10. To marry maharim relatives, mother, sister, daughters, etc., etc. 11. To eat dead meat, carrion, and pork, and drink blood. 12. Usury merely a prohibition in Moses' messages. 13. To commit legitimate sins and transgressions. 14. To say about God what cannot be known. The first 12 taboos are clear and self-explanatory. The remaining 2, whoever needs further elaboration. E. The attribute illegitimate for a sin implies the existence of a legitimate. The attribute illegitimate for a sin implies the existence of a legitimate sin. In addition to the subdivision of sin in chapter 42, verse 37, and chapter 53, verse 32, into major and minor sins. But what are the legitimate sins? The Arabic term for sin is ithm. This term occurs 48 times in the book, mostly in the context of A, to stay behind, to fall back. For example, when we say she camel fell back, athamat an-naqa, that is, it stays behind the rest of the caravan. Or B, to abstain or refrain, as in if one is forced by necessity without fulfilled disobedience or transgressing due limits, then is he guiltless. فَلَا إِثْمَ عَلَيْهِ. Baqarah 173. The sinner in this context is someone who does something that others do not do. The first context expresses a legitimate sin, while the second refers to an illegitimate sin, an illegitimate sin. The horseman who falls back with his horse in a race, the student who falls behind the rest of the class, the pupil who stays behind the group on an excursion, these sins are all legitimate. But whoever holds back his witness when he should give it commits an illegitimate sin, because conceal not evidence, for whoever conceals it, his heart is tainted with sin, ithmun, and Allah knows all that you do. Baqarah 285. If alcohol is used for the benefit of society, for example, as an anesthetic in surgical operations, as was done before the discovery of chloroform, it is classified as legitimate sin. The same drug can yield both a great sin and great benefit depending on the intentions of its use. It is a great sin if alcohol is used for pure pleasure and if it is consumed until the brain is intoxicated so that a person cannot control his tongue any longer. If gossip is used to defame your relatives at home and your colleagues in the workplace, it is classified as slander and a great sin. But if it's used as a tool by the secret intelligence services in order to gain advantage over the nation's enemy, it is a legitimate sin. The Arabic term for transgression, baghi, is used 96 times in the book. In a more literal sense, it means to seek hard in order to obtain something desirable. Mostly the term is used to indicate a violation of moral standards, implying injustice, rudeness, and causing enmity. It means the opposite of doing good and is, as the book says, a rebellion against God's command of justice. God commands justice, the doing of good, and liberty to kith and kin, and he forbids all shameful deed and injustice and rebellion. Al-Baghi. Nahl 90. And yet there are situations where we find legitimate forms of transgression. For example, if you look at the issue of the actually prohibited acts of seeking oracles from lost casting, if at the beginning of a football match lots are cast in order to decide what team plays on which side and who kicks off, it is a legitimate transgression. If, however, lot casting is practiced in matters of trade, marriage, travel, or even in political and military affairs, an example to decide on war or peace, it is an illegitimate transgression. We know that deliberate, callous theft is an illegitimate form of taking things away, but paying the price and to take things away after one has paid for them is perfectly legitimate. We believe that in every legal system there are many gray areas where legislation is not and can never be clear cut. Between the definite limits of Allah's, we are faced with an area full of ambiguities. It is as the Prophet says, the lawful is clear and the unlawful is clear. The lawful is clear and the unlawful is clear, and in between are ambiguities. F. The prohibition to say things about God without knowledge is based on the book's injunction 7, chapter 7, I think, verse 33 to 44. Widely known examples of these things said without knowledge are the content of the fatwas by the scholars who have invented an increasing number of absolute taboos, close to 100 by now, including the absolute ban on smoking, adopting children, surrogate motherhood, listening to music, and singing in public. Even clear examples are their fatwas, which by applying all sort of legal tricks, applying the strategy of fraudum, legis agir, allow dubious monetary institutes to run their business under the name of Islamic banking, which to our mind is just a different way of legalizing serious financial fraud. The book tells us that the prohibition to say things about God without knowledge was first revealed as a normal prohibition, but was later because of its seriousness upgraded to an absolute taboo. But say not for any false things that your tongue may put forth, this is lawful and this is forbidden, so as to ascribe false things to God, for those who ascribe false things to God will never prosper. Nahl 116. We have reached the end of major sins or major and minor sins in the Quran, and next will be followed up by what is right, al-ma'ruf. That will be followed up next.